In November 1934, Butler alleged the existence of a political conspiracy of Wall Street interests to overthrow President Roosevelt. That's right, overthrow Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. A series of allegations that came to be known in the media as the business plot. A special committee of the House of Representatives, headed by Representatives John W. McCormick of Massachusetts and Samuel Dickstein of New York, who was later alleged to have been skipping forward here through the documentation just a bit, this McCormick-Dickstein committee was a precursor to the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which, as we know, became a standing committee, and it was at the forefront of the process of trying to root out communists as we made our way in history into the 1950s, etc. In November 1934, Butler told the committee that a group of businessmen, saying they were backed by a private army in the neighborhood of 500,000, that's 500,000, ex-soldiers and others that had been recruited, intended to establish a fascist dictatorship here in the United States of America. Now, folks, if that sounds so far-fetched, I'd like you to think about this period in history. Again, here we are, the era of the late 20s, the early 1930s. What was fascism doing around the world at that time? What was fascism up to in Germany, in Italy? What was happening also with international bankers who were funding movements underway also in the Soviet Union, in Russia? Folks, the work of authors like Jim Marrs, also Joseph P. Farrell, Dr. Joseph Farrell, and many other authors do a very thorough investigation and exposition of this period of history and of how those powerful international bankers that many of us have come to know and think of as the New World Order. Some folks call the House of Rothschild and or other influences monetarily from Western Europe in that regime as well. Whether you want to call them the New World Order, the Illuminati, it makes no matter to your humble host, but I want you to hear how powerful and how capable these entities were as far back as 1930, ladies and gentlemen. 80 years ago, the power that they wielded and what they were capable of doing at that time. I return now to the material. Butler had been asked to lead this coup d'etat, this fascist dictatorship, the military branch thereof. And he had been asked to do so by Gerald P. McGuire, supposedly a quote-unquote Bond salesman with Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company. Now, moving forward just a bit in the interest of time, in its report, the committee, again, the House of Representatives Special Committee appointed to investigate the claims, at first stated that it was unable to confirm Butler's statements other than the proposal from McGuire, which itself was the root of this, which it considered more or less confirmed by McGuire's own European reports. And of course, the media, the New York media, the New York Times, they had some immediate reaction to this, but we know that they were bought, paid for, and funded by these very powers that were attempting to instigate this plot. What's important is when we listen to the committee's final report. What I had just cited from a moment ago was the initial findings. When the committee's final report was released, the Times said the committee purported, quote unquote, purported to report that a 2-month investigation had convinced it that General Butler's story of a fascist march on Washington was alarmingly true. This quote actually comes from the New York Times in reaction to the committee's final report. And here in just a moment, we're going to get our actual final quote from the committee report, but we'll continue just one more moment with the Times reaction. It also alleged definite proof had been found that the much-publicized fascist march on Washington, which was to have been led by Major Butler, was actually contemplated. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay with me through this next commercial break. We'll return to the curious case of Smedley Butler. And ladies and gentlemen, we are back with the Crimson Pill. I am your host, Antonin Fiore, and we have been talking thus far about the curious case of Smedley Butler. And I'd like to remind you that we're beginning with this exposition of his life and his experiences by way of returning our conversation to last week's program and our discussion of NASA, NASA's cover-ups, the comet Elenin, and many of its friends that are on their way into our backyard for a bit of a cookout, if you will, coming in these next few months. That having been said, let's return to Smedley Butler and the most important part of this curious case. It is the final report issued by this special House committee, headed by McCormick and Dickstein. They confirmed some of Butler's accusations in its final report, and now I will begin to quote again. Begin quote, "In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." Now, we think that we know that no fascist organization was put into place, point of fact. We think we know that, and yet those of us who've been paying attention to history since this period moving forward, and in fact those of us who look around us right now and look at FEMA, look at some of these presidential executive orders and presidential directives that have been issued just recently, but also over the last 15 to 20 years, I think we know different. I think we know a different story about fascism than what the official sources would like to have us believe is the case about our country. But if we turn our attention back to this exact quote, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. Now, if I draw an analogy for you folks, if I'm telling you a story about a person who is mugged on the streets of New York, and if I tell you that the attacker threatens them, "I have this gun, I will shoot you unless you give me your wallet now." And then if we skip the story forward just a bit, and I tell you that the person who was attacked remained alive, remained living, then we could draw some conclusions. We could make inferences. The first one that we would draw is, if they walked away with their life, then they probably complied with the wishes of the attacker. They probably handed over that wallet. And folks, if you turn your attention back to this period in history, I think you'll find that we did, in fact, hand over that wallet. I'd like to turn your attention to the Emergency Banking Act, dated 1933. Early in the tenure of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, the Emergency Banking Act was established, which some of you, if you've already done some research in this regard, will know that this was perhaps the final nail in the coffin of the American economy. You see, this happened in the window when they had the emergency banking holiday. They closed all banks. This is in the window when the president abrogated the gold standard. This is in the window when the Federal Reserve Bank was made formally, officially, and finally the bank, the man that had his hand on the coffers. And anybody who was not prepared to play ball with the Federal Reserve Bank, in other words, any independent banks that didn't wish, they simply weren't invited to play ball any longer. This is the window of time when, as part of the terms of this Emergency Banking Act, the president had the ability to declare a national emergency and have absolute control over the national finances and foreign exchange of the United States in the event of such an emergency that the president himself had the ability to declare and impose without the help or the acceptance agreement or mandate of Congress. You might recall that this is the window of time not only that the abrogation of the gold standard occurred, but when all Americans were forced to surrender their gold holdings, to turn them in exchange for Federal Reserve notes. Folks, your humble host doesn't have time to make a thorough exposition of this subject either, but merely to provide the signposts for you to be alert, to pay attention at each of these milestones in American history. It started with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which was passed in very shady, very sketchy circumstances. If you've read G. Edward Griffin's work, the creature from Jekyll Island, you'll know more of the details of this. There are a lot of folks who can provide you the detailed sources on these. It's the duty of your humble host to try to provide some of these signposts. You might be wondering, why is it that I never heard about Smedley Butler, that I never heard of this business plot or these accusations? Well, folks, it is clear, I think, and evident from his service and from his lifetime that Smedley Butler is what we would call a good old American red, white, and blue straight shooter, a man that did not play ball with people that were out for their own financial interests. He was a straight shooter. It's why the President of the United States himself asked Smedley Butler to go into Philadelphia for that 2-year tenure to clean up the town and its corruption before returning to his service in the Marine Corps. And also, you might be wondering, how is it that we didn't know? Well, I want to turn your attention back to one subject we spoke of last week's program, which was Harry Truman, President of the United States, and how the power of compartmentalization of information as well as classification of information is so absolute and complete. When Harry Truman became president on April 12, 1945, after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, he made a speech and the following quote to reporters. Again, quote, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know if you fellas ever had a load of hay fall on you, but what they told me yesterday, what happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Folks, he was not talking about just learning of the death of the president. He had only been informed that day of the Manhattan Project, our research program to develop and implement the atomic bomb. In the lead-up to Roosevelt's death, the vice president was not made aware of this until the day he assumed office. Folks, join us back in a few moments to continue. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Crimson Pill with your host, Antonin Fiore. We've been talking about this most curious case of Smedley Butler in context of how exactly and totally powerful the process of compartmentalization and classification of information is in our country, which is supposed to be the most free and open and transparent country in the world, right? Well, we know how horribly that has been changed through the course of the last 80 years. Folks, I'd like to give you the call-in number. I will warn you, we probably won't get to these first calls until at least 10 or 15 minutes from now, but that number is 1-800-313-9443, 1-800-313-9443 if you'd like to call in and be a part of today's program. It's at this point that we left at the break that I was sharing with you the power of compartmentalization of information. Harry Truman himself, good old give 'em hell Harry, was made completely unaware. He was left out of the access, out of the loop about any awareness or knowledge of the Manhattan Project itself. That was the program of research and development leading to the implementation, the first use of the atomic weapons. And folks, what is so alarming about this is that Franklin Roosevelt had been in failing health for years, and in particular in the months just preceding his own death. It was common knowledge that he was not, let's say, long for the world. It was common knowledge that, yes, there was going to be a presidential succession taking place at some time, and yet the power of compartmentalization is so replete that Harry Truman was not made aware of it until he had officially taken the oath of office and become president. And folks, just between you and me, and just a sort of a preview for future shows, being made aware, finally being briefed of the Manhattan Project was not the only thing that was dropped on Give 'em Hell Harry, which caused him to say, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Yes, there was quite a lot of other information that hit him suddenly as well. You know, in fact, we talk about the compartmentalization. The scope of the Manhattan Project was more than 130,000 people.